Hello, and welcome to the second installment of Critical Legal AI Literacies, a speaker series sponsored by the Lillian Goldman Law Library through the generous support of the Oscar M. Reebhausen Fund at Yale Law School. Today's speaker on the subject of his Georgetown Law Journal article, Dystopian Dreams, Utopian Nightmares, AI and the Permanence of Racism, is Professor Chaz Arnett. Professor Arnett is the Jacob A. France Professor of Law at the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law. Professor Arnett teaches in the areas of race and technology, criminal procedure, juvenile law, and education law, and his research interests lie at the intersection of race, surveillance, and technology. Before joining the faculty at the University of Maryland, Professor Arnett was an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and a trial attorney with public defenders' offices in Baltimore and New Orleans. He joins us via Zoom from Baltimore, Maryland. Thank you, Professor Arnett, for speaking to us today.
Good afternoon to you all, and thank you again for the invitation. This is amazing to be a part of this, and also for you all to have a critical AI series. I feel like much of the work that's being done in terms of ways, raising questions and awareness about AI at law schools across the country aren't squarely focused on bringing critical scholars and questions and dialogues to the forefront. So thank you again for this opportunity. So a few months ago at Y Combinator's AI Startup School, which is a huge conference for hundreds of engineers and developers, Elon Musk virtually appeared on a large screen telling the audience the following, quote, "We are at the very, very early stage of the intelligent Big Bang. Being a multi-planet species increases the probable lifespan of civilization or consciousness or intelligence, both biological and digital. I think we're quite close to digital superintelligence. If it doesn't happen this year, next year for sure," unquote. He would later go on at the conference to note the following. "I guess I sort of agree with Jeff Hinton that maybe it's a 10 to 20% chance of annihilation. But look on the bright side, that's a 80 to 90% probability of a great outcome," unquote. We've all been subject to AI hype. I think we've all become quite accustomed to hearing these claims over the past few years since the introduction of ChatGPT and the expansion of other generative AI tools and platforms. The typical, I would deem exuberant techno-optimism with pops and shades of risk assessment and caution that suggests we need some level of AI ethics and safety. I believe all this works towards the same ends and aims of ultimately propping up a utopian-driven understanding of AI with significant costs for all of us to pay, some more than others. This past year, I published a paper called Dystopian Dreams, Utopian Nightmares, AI and the Permanence of Racism. In many ways, it emerged out of my frustration of what I was witnessing in the solely positive narrative being built around generative AI and some of the daily harms that I was researching and seeing in this area. In the paper, I stressed a number of points, namely that one, AI utopian and hype AI utopian hype is real and dangerous. Second, that an Afrofuturism lens helps us understand how the racially marginalized in the West and those in the global South bear some of the biggest burdens in this push. Third, that the AI hype acts to influence law and policy developments as well. And four, that we need new approaches for responding to this moment. Really, I would say to this narrative, right? Because it's a story being told to us about AI. So I think we need values and principles to guide us in developing our counter narrative and being able to tell a different story. So I want to talk to you about each of those components of the paper briefly before we open up for questions or thoughts that you may have. So perhaps let's begin with AI hype. So, and I believe a couple of weeks ago to start off this critical AI series, you all heard from Dr. Emily Bender as well. So I don't have to go in too deeply around AI hype, but um, I think you all have witnessed this, right? Comparisons of Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, to Robert Oppenheimer, right, the American theorist, physicist, who helped develop the first nuclear weapons during World War II. I believe it was New York Magazine took out a big front page ad comparing him to Oppenheimer, right? Sort of making the comparisons between the dangerousness of AI to nuclear weapons. We've heard many of the stories and articles around sort of doomsday predictions and how AI could go wrong. Much to do as well in the context of jobs being replaced. I was at a conference most recently at Harvard Law School and sat in on a panel where the National Labor Relations Board, their first chief artificial intelligence officer, was telling a room full of students that all the jobs that they anticipated having upon graduation will likely not be there because generative AI will have taken and replaced those jobs. And he did so in almost a joking and gleeful way, right? And I think it's good to remember that these things are constantly being put out there, the loss of jobs. And it's interesting for me thinking about this. If you look historically in terms of the war on poverty, if you look back 30 years ago, there was so much happening at the federal government level, particularly during Bill Clinton's administration, to require those receiving federal welfare benefits to demonstrate that they're looking for jobs, that they would hold a job, that they would have a job, right? So many hoops and hurdles. And to get to a place now where the federal government is adopting and readily advocating, this view of the world, right? One in which the idea by the big tech leaders is that many jobs will be replaced. However, it's not so bad because it will free us up to do quote unquote other things with our time, right? And even some tech leaders have flirted with the idea of supporting a living wage, right, or some supplemental income akin to a living wage, right, which is a complete reverse if you think about federal government's approach to employment 30 years prior. And the last thing I would point out here is the notion AI hype with this idea of being able to surpass human intelligence, right? And speaking of Dr. Bender and Alex Hanna's work in their book, The AI Con: How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want, they note the following, right? They said the language of doomsday is a ruse to keep us focused on imaginary scenarios filled with awe at modern robber barons, allegedly potentially world-ending technology, and too distracted to see the daily harms being done in its name. They go on to note, this framing is useful to those creating the technology because it makes them appear powerful, if not godlike, in their technical creation. But this belies what these technologies are doing to the rest of us, which is threatening stable careers and replacing them with gig work, slashing personnel in government, cheapening out social services, and degrading creativity. However, I think we can analyze the impacts utopian hype has, not just by these things happening at the top, but also on the ground and how people, institutions, agencies, and sectors have been thoroughly captured by the frenzy and cultist space in generative AI. And I'll just mention a few examples, some of which you've probably seen in the news. But most recently, there have been a lot of talk about the development and start of schools that are secondary education schools, private schools that are completely run by AI, right? There's an education company that has led to the development of these private schools called the Alpha schools. If you haven't seen it in the news, developed in both Texas and Virginia, where schools are using AI to generate personalized lessons and plans with the idea that this would enable teachers to spend their time motivating students rather than having to teach students. The AI can take that on. And the pitch by Alpha School is a sensational one, I would argue. And it goes like this. Their pitch is, for $65,000 a year, students study for just 2 hours a day using adaptive apps and personalized lessons plans and spend their afternoons on life skills, such as learning to ride a bike or financial literacy, right? So you see this deep belief and investment in the power of generative AI, such that we could take teachers out of the classroom for young students. Another example, in California, I believe the state of California just recently issued one of the first major fines for lawyers using ChatGPT in developing court documents, right? The California court issued a fine of $10,000 for filing in the state appeal court that was full of fake quotations generated by ChatGPT, right? The fine appeared to be one of the largest issued for over AI fabrication by California court. And in the opinion, the court noted that 21 of the 23 quotes from cases cited in the attorney's opening brief were completely made up. 21 out of the 23 quotes from cases were completely made up. It also noted that there were numerous out-of-state and federal courts that had been confronting and dealing with this issue, which is the citation of fake legal authority. Another example, we think about California, sticking with California. I don't know if you all saw that nearly 2 months after hundreds of prospective California lawyers complained that their bar exams were plagued with technical problems and irregularities, the state's legal licensing body admitted had to come clean and admit that some of the multiple choice questions were developed with the aid of artificial intelligence, right? So not only do we see this generous faith and reliance on these tools, but you see them being rolled out with little to no regulation, discretion, or even testing. The California State Bar exam developed many of its questions using ChatGPT and even incorporated some questions from first-year law exams, right? So we are beginning to see, if we're thinking about sort of the manifestations of AI hype and these utopian approaches to AI, the development of unhealthy relationships with AI as well, right? In a recent episode of the New York Times podcast, The Daily, journalists covered the rise of people falling deep into the delusion of ChatGPT and other generative AI tools. For example, one of the stories that they covered in this podcast episode of The Daily involved a guy who was essentially fooled into believing that he developed some new mathematical equation. Now, you may ask, how does that happen? But many of these generative AI programs and tools are geared towards providing flattering statements, right? This is a brilliant idea. This is amazing. I like the way that you're thinking, right? How can we operationalize this? This one gentleman who they interviewed, and they ended up combing over 3,000 pages worth of conversation in ChatGPT, ultimately convinced him and his friends to embark on developing a lab to start building products, the whole nine, right? And you know, I don't think it takes much. I know I can't be the only one at this point to have friends and family who now turn to ChatGPT for any and everything, right? Friends who will use the program for hours on end posting questions about anything, right? Like where to eat that night and what they should select off the dinner menu, right? Drafting jokes that they could use at a upcoming social outing, seeking relationship and parenting advice. I even had a friend who was dealing with a medical condition who was recently seeking a second medical opinion after she received the report, and had another friend suggest that she upload her medical records into ChatGPT to see what ChatGPT had to say about her medical condition, right? So he's deep reliance, deep faith. And I think much of that has come on the heels of the AI hype and utopian approaches to this technology. I mean, we are really at a really interesting and frightening juncture, I would say. And here I'm thinking in terms of frightening about the 16-year-old that committed suicide after days on end in conversation with ChatGPT. Last thing I'll note here with respect to the AI hype and utopian approach, much to do has been made of leading tech leaders and their emphasis on transhumanism, and also like what has been characterized by many scholars as a eugenic desire, right? This idea that we can create and craft the perfect human being, that we can move beyond our deepest flaws and concerns. As Yuval Noah Harari argues in his book titled Nexus, Brief History of Information Networks from the Stone Age to AI, we have an obsession with information and collecting information. And in this philosophical exploration, Harari notes that and points out that even we think that collecting data and information will lead us to progress, will lead us the truth or wisdom, or even justice. And he argues that this is not right. Right? The collection of information and data doesn't by itself make us smarter or wiser or more progressive or anywhere closer to the truth, but it does and always has done one thing, and that is increase power, right? And it is important to think about these power dynamics because undergirding the utopian appeals are visions for what the world should be and look like that are deeply staunched in these transhumanist eugenic desires. Scholars Timnit Gebru and Emil Torres recently published a piece called the Tescroll Bundle. And Tescroll is a long acronym for the many different areas and categories that they assign to leading tech innovators, so to say. And Tescroll stands for, or denotes T for transhumanism, E for extrapianism, S for singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. If you're not familiar with their Tescroll Bundle arguments, it's really interesting read. But what's the connection here to eugenics and this desire to create the perfect human? Well, Gebru and Torres talk about two different waves of eugenics, right? The first wave of eugenics, they noted, it is noteworthy, that the negative eugenics, they argue, was embraced not just by German fascists, but progressives and liberals elsewhere in Europe and North America in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? And the idea was that eugenics, you could predict, you could ascertain individuals who were worthy, those who were not worthy. The optimism of eugenics and its aspirations to apply scientific ideas actively was something that these liberals, self-proclaimed liberals at the time, turned to, right? And the first wave of eugenics in which they describe was ultimately seen as repugnant years later for many reasons. And one of them was the underlying racist, xenophobic, ableist, classist, and sexist attitudes that animated both the negative and positive eugenics. Those deemed unfit were variously labeled defectives. They were labeled imbeciles, idiots, congenital invalids, right? Morons and feeble-minded. The high-achieving individuals were encouraged to produce larger families, to populate, right? Many eugenics also accepted the superiority of the white race. Now, much of this technology along the lines of AI, Jabrou and Toure's reason is part of a second wave of eugenics in which technology is leading, right? And such technologies open the door to human, quote unquote, improvements that do not necessitate population level policies like in the past, nor do they require transgenerational timescales to operate. You can put them into play immediately. So when you think about sort of some of the bioethic technologies today that could allow parents to potentially design their children by selecting genes based on hereditary assumptions, much of that is steeped in eugenics. And the technology and leading advocates of AI are steeply committed to pushing this framework and understanding of these technologies, right? So the new eugenics claims to be liberal while emphasizing the freedom of parents to decide whether and how to produce enhanced offspring, right? So again, it's tied to this idea of being able to create better new individuals. And much of that has always been steeped in ethno-nationalism, white supremacy, and the like. Afrofuturism, all right? This brings me to Afrofuturism. Why do I use this? And if you haven't had the opportunity to read my paper, I would greatly encourage you being able to do so. It is part of a larger symposium in the Georgetown Law Journal, where a number of leading scholars are turning to Afrofuturism to understand various issues. But Afrofuturism is such a wide-ranging category and field, right? You can think of it even as an area of theory that I feel like I certainly don't do justice to here in my paper. But I am an avid fan of Afrofuturistic imagery, story, themes. So I wanted to tie some of my academic wranglings with my explorations in this genre. So generally understood, you can think of this wide body of work in Afrofuturism as a lens for African peoples and descendants to make sense of their current world and imagining different possibilities, whether it be in the future or in the past. And there are always lessons in these stories about hope, about danger, about love, fear, subordination, perseverance, you name it. You could think of the Black Panther movie series along the lines of Afrofuturism. You can think about Janelle Monáe's earlier music, where she portrayed herself as an android, right? Or the work of N.K. Jemisin. So many different areas to explore. And not all Afrofuturism is about race or struggle. But in this paper, I explore Space Traders, essay written by Derek Bell, Octavia Butler's Parable series, and the TV show Westworld, right? And I could talk for days about all three of these sources. But I would say if you haven't seen them, read them, go do so, except for season 3 of Westworld. Not sure what happened there. Just skip it, take my word on it. But several themes emerge from these works that I explore, right? One is that there is always dystopias lurking behind utopias. Second is that it is always the most marginalized and vulnerable that pay the heaviest costs in these schemes that rely heavily upon technology. And third, this idea that humans cannot escape most of their worst tendencies, which are to push towards differentiation, domination, and destruction, right? Now, just very briefly about each of those bodies of work. Westworld, if you aren't familiar with the TV show, it's generally based on the idea that we're in a not so distant future. We've developed sentient, almost sentient beings, these AIs that for all intents and purposes, you can barely tell the difference between them and real humans. And the sort of storyline kicks off with these beings called hosts ultimately becoming sentient, right? And the struggle between humans and these AI characters. And it raises so many themes that I think are important in understanding sort of the dangers of AI hype. Space Traders is an essay written by Derek Bell. If you aren't familiar with Derek Bell's work, as law students, you should be. But Derek Bell wrote this essay in which it's a play on sort of racial politics and color blindness. Essentially, what happens in Space Traders is that aliens come to the planet. They make an offer specifically to the United States that, hey, if you turn over all of your Black citizens, we'll give you everything your heart could imagine, right? New energy sources, gold, all sorts of precious metals. We'd clean up your water, your oceans, your streams, anything that you want. Just turn over your Black citizens. And the storyline dovetails from there, and ultimately it ends with the U.S. President and there being a big nationwide vote in which the majority vote for Black folks to be turned over. And Octavia Butler's Parable series, another Afrofuturistic work that you should check out if you haven't had the opportunity, focuses on this post-apocalyptic world where the main character is wrestling with how to survive in a world that is incredibly violent, that is incredibly classist, and she depicts a character who ultimately becomes president, who's a big Christian nationalist, and his slogan is "Make America Great Again." And this was decades before Donald Trump was even on the scene as a presidential candidate. So pernicious and prescient in many in many ways. And I could talk more about these works in the Q&A, but I pulled those three themes from this body of work to help illuminate some of the dangers here in falling victim to the AI hype. Another point to make here is that I argue in this paper that AI hype, utopian approaches to generative AI technologies also have the impact of influencing law and policy, right? If you think about Jabru and Torres's work, the textual list, they have influenced policymakers and researchers who may not be aligned, with those utopian ideals into prioritizing artificial general intelligence agenda while creating unsafe products, evading accountability, and siphoning resources away from organizations around the world, building task-specific models that serve the needs of specific communities. This all speed ahead faith in these technologies, you could see impacting the development of law and policy, right? And much of that comes on the basis of this narrative, a strong narrative around AI. And that narrative, that story is one that really relies on two big things, right? One, is this notion that AI is all powerful, right? That we're on the verge of something big, and we need policy that does not stifle innovation. The second thing is based on this idea of security and public safety, right? That we need AI for safety reasons because, you know, China and other countries that are not our allies are moving ahead, and we need to be able to counter them as global threats and powers as innovators in AI. And much of this, and I'm not going to belabor sort of this point around the influence of this utopian approach and its influence on law and policy, but I'll just give you a quick example. And much of this I think is represented and captured in the policies that have been passed under this current administration. One of the first things that President Trump did in the first week in the office was issue a number of statements and policies with respect to AI. And on January 23rd, 2025, he issued the following, right, entitled "Removing Barriers to American Leadership in Artificial Intelligence." And it notes, "By the authority vested in me as president by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, it is hereby ordered as following. Section 1, purpose. The United States has long been at the forefront of artificial intelligence innovation, driven by the strength of free market, world-class research institutions, and entrepreneurial spirit. To maintain this leadership, we must develop AI systems that are free from ideological bias or engineered social agendas. With the right government policies, we can solidify our position as a global leader in AI and secure a brighter future for all Americans. This order revokes certain existing AI policies and directives that act as barriers to American AI innovation, clearing a path for the United States to act decisively to retain global leadership in artificial intelligence." Section 2, policy. It is the policy of the United States to sustain and enhance America's global AI dominance in order to promote human flourishing, economic competitiveness, and national security. And that was in January, within the first couple of days of the administration. 6 months later, this past summer, July 23rd, 2025, this administration issued executive orders. And in doing so, they titled this sort of notice about this as "Preventing Woke AI in the Federal Government." Right. And again, it notes a couple of things, right? Section 1, purpose. Artificial intelligence will play a critical role in how Americans of all ages learn new skills, consume information, and navigate their daily lives. Americans will require reliable outputs from AI, but when ideological biases or social agendas are built into AI models, they can distort the quality and accuracy of output. One of the most pervasive and destructive of these ideologies is so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in the AI context, DEI includes the suppression of distortion of factual information about race or sex, manipulation of racial or sexual representation in model outputs, incorporation of concepts like critical race theory, transgenderism, unconscious bias, intersectionality, and systemic racism, and discrimination on the basis of race or sex. DEI displaces the commitment to truth in favor of preferred outcomes, and as recent history illustrates, poses an existential threat to reliable AI, right? So you see this deeply, what my colleague Spencer Overton refers to in a forthcoming paper as ethno-nationalist approach to AI policy and regulation. And then it's no coincidence that at this very moment, these policies have paved the way for the development of data centers. Here in Maryland, where I live at, it's a current battle in Prince George's County, which is a majority Black county suburb outside of Washington, D.C., for the development of a data center, right? And the potential environmental harms there. A corresponding protest and advocacy push is happening in Shelby County, Memphis, Tennessee, also majority Black neighborhoods and community are fighting the prospect of new data centers being placed in their neighborhood. So not only do you see approaches to deregulation, I would say, of AI being steeped in racist ideology and approaches, right? And I would say racist mistruths and sort of characterizing DEI as a threat to AI. You see the real effects taking place from those policies. So I want to save time for questions. I'll just mention very briefly one of the things that I argue in this paper is that we need to begin being able to develop a new narrative, a new approach to AI governance and regulation. In the instance where we believe that AI is a worthy tool and technology, and outright challenges and banning of AI in the context where we see or deem that it should not be used and or deployed. And I mentioned a number of values that should guide those initial discussions, that narrative development and framing, that approach to government regulation. And all throughout the paper, I talk a lot about utopianism versus dystopianism. But I'll just mention a number of these values, and we can talk a bit about that with the remaining time left. But I mentioned utopia, which is a concept that I pulled from Ruha Benjamin's work and others, but the idea that we should approach government regulation, law, and policy with respect to generative AI, not from a utopian perspective where it's all hands off, it should be complete deregulation, right? And we think about the spending bill that was passed this past session that came very close to incorporating a ban on all states from being able to regulate AI, right? That comes from a utopian frame. And I don't think a complete dystopian approach and concern, a doomsday approach to the technology is beneficial as well, but something in the middle that recognizes that there may be some value to the technology in certain contexts, certainly when technology governance is more participatory. I mentioned Sankofa, which is something that is used a lot throughout Afrofuturistic literature, media, et cetera. Sankofa is a symbol that represents this idea of taking something from the past or something useful, important, and bringing it into present day. And with that, I speak about sort of just having a long memory, right? I think the attacks on education and learning really make this tough, right? This idea to wipe all of history, whether it is reconstructing or resurrecting Confederate monuments or, holding remembrance for people like Charlie Kirk, who spewed distorted versions of history, right? Or whether it's changing government web pages and the like. We need a long history in the way that we approach and think about these technologies, and remembering how eugenics paved the way for horrible atrocities in the past, right? So sort of being able to perceive how that manifests today, or even how things like racial capitalism is finding its way in what we are deeming as data capitalism or surveillance capitalism today. And finally, I mentioned these concepts of data justice and data power. Data justice is a concept that attempts to elevate the significant questions of social justice in the context of expansive datafication processes and transformation. I think much of our data governance regulation is stale. It's based upon outdated traditional data privacy frameworks. And I think data justice raises some important questions. And data power is related to data justice, but it focuses on the capacity and agency of marginalized communities, most burdened by data processes and affordances, to be able to make demands, right? To be able to raise questions, to be able to participate in a democratic process that is governing of new technologies. So I know I've said a lot, so I'll end there and open up for questions that you all may have.
For Professor Arnett. Yes, go ahead.
All right, so question about kind of the perhaps one framing that might unify your I don't like the hype and I don't like the doom, right? Both of those are types of emergencies, especially when the hype is reflected into the doom by using the China rhetoric. And given that this administration for the last few months have been quite aggressive in the emergency rhetoric, given the long history of use of emergency throughout, political history for achieving certain ends, I was curious: is just the hype is just power grab, or is there is there anything other than power grab to it?
I think it's so one, thank you for that. Really, really good comments and questions. I think it's a power grab that is staunchly focused on sort of reaping as much capital as possible, right? At the moment, right? I know the FTC has referred to generative AI as a marketing scheme. I know other scholars sort of talk about the surveillance hustle in many ways, and data capturing and theft, and sort of the great amount that could be gleaned. I think that I was just reading the other day that Meta became another one of the few to reach the trillion in terms of its evaluation and financial evaluation, and that in large part that comes from sort of investments in AI. But much of the studies now are showing that big companies are using and relying upon generative AI less, right? So there's a prediction that there may be a bubble at play, but that's a lot to say that I think that there is power. I mean, I would have never imagined prior to last November, I talked so much about sort of the influence of big tech on the state, right, and the automation of the government in many ways, and then seeing Elon Musk have a role in it for all, so much of this 2025 sort of hit that right nail on the head. So it's a power grab, and it's also positioning for continual capital exploitation moving forward.
Yes.
How are the administration's anti-quote woke orders likely to be manifested in a concrete way?
Oh, I think that that's already happening. I think that's already happening. So these executive orders were, and this is from talking to insiders in tech companies already, right? So this administration's order was, and I didn't really speak to that part of it, was in direct response to the prior administration, Biden's administration's executive orders, right? Which actually, even though they were not mandatory, provided guidance such that tech companies should be conducting audits of the AI technologies that they're using. They should be sharing sort of like some of the proprietary information with the government, and many of these companies have began to take steps to do so. I think those that guidance from the Biden administration was like the end of 2023, if I'm not mistaken, around that time, and even the prior to that blueprint for AI Bill of Rights. Some of these tech companies that had actually began taking steps to comply with this initiative from the Biden administration, and since these executive orders from Trump have abandoned and had not had to worry about sort of the requirements of filing audits, sharing audits with the government, and conducting audits and the like.
Yes, go ahead.
With the vacuum of legislative regulation, what are the ways that you could suggest? I don't know, we're still in law school, right? But moving forward, what are the ways that you will see these challenges coming up? Like, would it be judicial? Would it be in courts? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think all of the above. But I will tell you, and thanks for the question. I'll tell you that in the circles that I am in terms of data privacy scholars and advocates, much of our gatherings, and I've been a part of a consortium that has, for the last couple of years, have been providing consultation to the Federal Trade Commission and the FCC as well. And much of our conversations now are in the future, right? Like, let's develop recommendations, let's develop strategies that we can implement down the road. Like, we're talking years down the road. But I think it would be both in court, outside of court, legislative efforts. I mean, the idea is that at some point down the road, there may be more favorable courts, there may be more favorable legislatures to pass, regulatory matters. And the states have taken the opportunity to pass data privacy bills, but the federal government is just, the American Data Privacy Act is just stalled, and won't be going anywhere anytime soon. So I think it will be both. And you see this AI technologies are coming up in criminal defense cases, right? So in a different context. So I think there will be some battles to come in courts and outside of court. But it's not hopeful from our end, about anything immediate.
We probably have time for one more short question. The other. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for this talk. I was just curious, when you were working with like pieces of speculative fiction, how you tie that back into like the work that you're doing. Like, it seems like you're pulling thoughts, ideas from them, thinking about like how the world might be different. But I'm just curious on like a functional level, how you kind of like go about thinking through that.
Yeah, so let me first say that 2 years ago, I got when I started thinking about this was like fall of 2023, like right after I got tenure. So I had a little more freedom to engage and incorporate speculative writing. But for me, it had always been like, I had been engaging with like Afrofuturism, books, writing, material, song, that has shaped my thinking about the law, policies, prospects for legal intervention the whole while. And this was an opportunity for me to actually bring some of those things to the forefront, and in ways that I think prior to tenure, there's might be a push for junior scholars to not do so. But these are things that were already shaping my understanding and my approach to how I think about the law, how I think about society, and how I think about the stories that we tell ourselves in terms of regulating technology as well. And I think much of what I try to do in this paper is to say that the problem is a narrative. The problem is a story, right? That we have a story, we have a narrative in our head when we think about these technologies, and that story, that narrative, impacts us and shapes how we approach regulation and what we deem to be dangerous, what we deem to be safe, what we deem to be ethical, and many of those same understandings and approaches, you find those things readily at the heart of Afrofuturistic work. So,
thank you so much, Professor Arnett, for joining us.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope that you all come to more of these gatherings in the series, because the critical work in the space is incredibly important. Feel free to reach out to me if anyone has questions or anything and want to chat further. But thank you all.